The institution of slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean was not merely a system of labor exploitation. It was an all-encompassing structure of social, economic, and sexual control. At its core, slavery relied on the brutal dehumanization of African men, women, and children, a system that affected all aspects of their lives. One of the most contentious and rarely discussed aspects of slavery is the relationships, both coerced and consensual, that developed between white women and enslaved black men. These relationships challenge many preconceived notions about power dynamics, agency, and racial boundaries during the slavery era. While much of the historical record focuses on white male exploitation of enslaved black women, the lesser explored interactions between white women and enslaved black men reveal a complex web of forbidden desires, abuse, resistance, and the transgression of social norms. To understand these relationships, one must first examine the social and legal structures of slavery that made such interactions fraught with danger and taboo. Enslaved black men were seen not only as laborers, but also as symbols of racial and sexual threat. White supremacy during slavery rested heavily on controlling black bodies, particularly the sexuality of black men. The idea of black men as inherently dangerous, hypersexualized beings was used to justify severe punishments and social segregation. At the same time, white women were placed on a pedestal of supposed moral and sexual purity. They were viewed as the custodians of white racial superiority, responsible for upholding the boundaries of race and class through their roles as mothers and wives. Any interaction between a white woman and an enslaved black man was thus considered a violation of these rigid boundaries, threatening the social order. The relationships that did develop between white women and enslaved black men often took place in the shadows, concealed from public view. In many cases, these relationships were deeply exploitative, a reflection of the power imbalance inherent in the system of slavery. White women, despite being subordinate to white men in the patriarchal structure of the time, still held significant power over enslaved people. A white woman could command, punish, and even sell an enslaved man, wielding authority that left little room for true consent. In such cases, sexual relationships between white women and enslaved black men were often coercive, driven by the white woman's sense of entitlement or her need to assert dominance in a system that otherwise rendered her powerless compared to white men. However, not all relationships can be easily categorized as purely coercive or consensual. The institution of slavery created an environment where the lines between consent and coercion were blurred, particularly for the enslaved. Enslaved black men, living under the constant threat of violence, may have engaged in relationships with white women as a means of survival. By acquiescing to a white woman's advances, an enslaved man might hope to gain favor, protection, or even the possibility of manumission. In such cases, what might appear as mutual affection or desire was often rooted in the harsh realities of power and survival within a brutal system. There were also instances where relationships between white women and enslaved black men seemed to emerge out of genuine affection or love, challenging the rigid racial hierarchies of the time. Such relationships were incredibly dangerous for both parties. For the enslaved man, being discovered in a sexual or romantic relationship with a white woman often meant death. Accusations of rape, whether true or fabricated, were common, and white men frequently responded with extreme violence to any suggestion that a black man had been intimate with a white woman. White women, too, faced severe social repercussions if their relationships with black men were exposed. They risked being ostracized, divorced, or even institutionalized, as their actions were seen as a betrayal of their race and class. The legal system further reinforced the dangers of these relationships. Anti-miscegenation laws, which prohibited sexual or marital relations between people of different races, were strictly enforced in many slaveholding societies. These laws were designed not only to maintain racial purity, but also to uphold the economic foundation of slavery. Children born to enslaved black men and white women posed a unique challenge to the legal structure of slavery. In most slaveholding societies, the status of a child followed that of the mother, meaning that a child born to a white woman would be free, even if the father was enslaved. This legal loophole created a significant incentive for slave owners to suppress and punish relationships between white women and enslaved black men, as such unions threatened the economic logic of slavery by potentially increasing the number of free black people. Despite these risks, the historical record contains numerous accounts of relationships between white women and enslaved black men. Many of these stories have been passed down through oral histories, letters, and court records, offering glimpses into the hidden dynamics of slavery. For example, court cases from the American South and the Caribbean sometimes reveal accusations against white women for engaging in illicit relationships with enslaved men. These cases often ended with severe punishments for the black men involved, while the white women were typically portrayed as victims of seduction or coercion, absolving them of responsibility. The cultural and psychological dimensions of these relationships are equally complex. White women who engaged in relationships with enslaved black men often found themselves navigating conflicting desires and societal expectations. On one hand, they were drawn to the physicality and presence of the enslaved men who worked in close proximity to them. On the other hand, they were acutely aware of the forbidden nature of these relationships and the consequences they might face if discovered. For some, these relationships may have represented a form of rebellion against the constraints of their own lives, a way to assert agency in a system that otherwise confined them to subservient roles within the household. For enslaved black men, the psychological impact of these relationships was profound. Being desired by a white woman in a society that dehumanized and objectified them could be both empowering and deeply unsettling. The constant threat of violence and retribution meant that any relationship, no matter how consensual it might appear, was fraught with danger. Moreover, the stigma attached to such relationships often followed black men even after emancipation, reinforcing negative stereotypes about their sexuality and morality. In the broader context of slavery, relationships between white women and enslaved black men reveal the contradictions and hypocrisies of a system built on racial and sexual exploitation. These relationships expose the ways in which slavery distorted human connections, turning intimacy into a battleground of power, survival, and resistance. They also highlight the agency of enslaved people who navigated these fraught relationships with courage and resourcefulness, often using them as a means to challenge or subvert the system that sought to oppress them. The legacy of these relationships continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about race, gender, and power. They remind us of the enduring scars of slavery and the ways in which its horrors continue to shape societal attitudes and structures. By examining these hidden histories, we can gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of human relationships under slavery and the resilience of those who endured its cruelties.